Please forgive me if I sound heated during this video. I am. I met a girl on a dating app maybe about 2 months ago, and we've been talking pretty consistently since. About a month ago, we planned a date, and up until the day of the date, everything was fine, but then she said she was feeling really sick, and we didn't go through with it. But she seemed really honest about it, and we just kept going, kept talking, and there was no big red flags, just she was sick and it didn't work out. Okay. About 5 days ago on Monday, I asked her, hey, I found out if I get off a little early on Friday. Do you want to maybe go on a date? She sent yes with 4 S's and an exclamation mark, and I was like, okay, perfect. Yesterday, I sent her the paragraph, the details. I tell her, I got a reservation for us at my favorite restaurant. I'm so excited to take you. I sent her the plan for the date, and just radio silence. Nothing. At the very least, I don't even care if you ghost me. Ghost me before this. Let me know that you can't go on the date. Do not waste my time. And then just silently bail. And I said, seriously, this is not cool of you. Why couldn't you at least let me know? I get back 20 minutes later, and she unadded me. No explanation. And that's the last I've heard from her. That was earlier this morning.
There is a moment in every long story where one side realizes the other has quietly left the room, not slammed the door, not screamed, just stood up, pushed the chair back, and walked away. That moment is where we are now. What happens next will decide whether modern relationships stabilize, collapse, or transform into something entirely different. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand why the shift did not happen overnight, why it was predictable, and why pretending it is not real anymore only makes the consequences sharper. Before we get into it, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more Angry Guy content and want every single video the moment we release it. It helps the channel grow, it keeps these conversations visible, and it ensures you do not miss what comes next. Also, if you want to learn how to protect yourself financially and grow your wealth in an increasingly unstable world, check out Angry's Crypto Academy. It is linked in the description of the video. Inside the academy, we focus on learning how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly, how to safeguard your assets, and how to think long-term rather than emotionally. If you care about independence and resilience, go check it out now. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support for the work I do here, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It is a simple way to support the channel directly, and it is always appreciated. Now let us get into the real conversation. For a long time, men were told a simple story. Work hard, be responsible, be patient, provide value, improve yourself. If you did those things, you would earn respect, partnership, and stability. That story was repeated by families, schools, media, and culture itself. It was not perfect, but it was coherent. You could see the path in front of you. You knew what effort was supposed to lead to. At the same time, women were told a different story, a story about empowerment, autonomy, and independence. On its own, that is not a bad thing. People should have agency over their lives. But over decades, that message began to drift. It stopped being about shared responsibility and became about unilateral expectation. The idea quietly formed that traditional obligations could be rejected, while traditional benefits could still be claimed. That imbalance did not appear all at once. It accumulated slowly, policy by policy, narrative by narrative, incentive by incentive. Men adapted. That part rarely gets acknowledged. Men listened. Men adjusted their behavior. They pulled back. They became more cautious. They stopped approaching. They delayed marriage. They avoided legal risk. They invested more time in work, hobbies, and solitude, not because they hated women, but because the cost-benefit equation no longer made sense. When effort is consistently met with suspicion, hostility, or punishment, withdrawal is not rebellion, it is self-preservation. For years, this withdrawal was mocked. Men were called immature, lazy, afraid, or broken. The narrative insisted that men were the problem, and if they just tried harder, changed more, and accepted less, things would improve. But the data kept moving in the opposite direction. Marriage rates declined. Birth rates fell. Relationship satisfaction dropped. Loneliness increased on both sides. None of this was a mystery. It was the predictable outcome of misaligned incentives. Then reality intervened. Economic pressure increased. Costs rose. Stability became harder to maintain. The safety nets people assumed would always be there began to strain. Suddenly, the independence narrative met practical limits. It turns out autonomy is expensive. It turns out building a life alone requires more than slogans. And in that moment, the same men who were told to step aside, to leave women alone, to stop participating, were suddenly expected to re enter the system as providers, protectors, and emotional anchors. This is where the tension exploded because men did not disappear. They simply redirected their energy. They built quieter lives, smaller circles, more controlled environments. Many found peace in opting out, not in anger, but in exhaustion. When someone has been told repeatedly that their presence is unwanted or dangerous, asking them to return without addressing the underlying issues is not reconciliation, it is denial. A lot of people misunderstand what men walking away actually means. It is not a movement fueled by hatred. It is not about punishment or revenge. It is a pattern of behavior that emerges when participation becomes irrational. Men are not organizing against women, they are reorganizing their lives away from systems that no longer reward good faith involvement. The legal landscape plays a role here. Modern systems often treat men as default liabilities. Financial risk, legal exposure, reputational damage, and long term obligations are disproportionately placed on men, while decision making power is increasingly centralized elsewhere. When the cost of a single mistake can follow you for decades, caution becomes rational, opting out becomes logical. Social dynamics amplify this effect. Public discourse often frames male boundaries as selfish, while female demands are framed as empowerment. That asymmetry matters. Respect cannot exist where accountability only flows in one direction. Relationships, whether personal or societal, require reciprocity. When reciprocity disappears, so does trust. Now add the role of enforcement. Men are frequently told they must comply with changing expectations while having little say in shaping them. Push back and you are labeled. Question assumptions and you are dismissed. Remain silent and you are blamed anyway. Under those conditions, silence followed by withdrawal is the only remaining lever. What we are witnessing now is not a sudden collapse. It is the delayed reaction to decades of imbalance. The system ran on stored goodwill, cultural inertia, and habit. That fuel has been spent. What remains is friction. Some women are beginning to notice the absence, not because men vanished entirely, but because they are no longer volunteering their time, resources, or emotional labor at the same rate. The casual safety net that existed by default is no longer guaranteed. That realization is uncomfortable, and discomfort often produces blame before introspection. This is where the conversation usually derails. So let me be very clear. This is not about declaring one gender superior or inferior. This is about incentives. Humans respond to incentives. Change the rules, and behavior changes. Ignore that reality, and outcomes worsen. Men were told their traditional roles were outdated, unnecessary, or oppressive. Many accepted that message. Now society is asking why those roles are no longer being filled. You cannot dismantle a structure and then demand its benefits remain intact. That is not how systems work. There is also a deeper psychological layer here. Men are problem solvers by nature. When faced with an unsolvable system, they do not protest endlessly. They disengage. They look for alternatives. They minimize exposure. This is not emotional, it is strategic. Women, on the other hand, we're often told that discomfort itself was injustice, that any friction meant someone else was failing them. That narrative removes the incentive to adapt. When adaptation finally becomes unavoidable, it feels like betrayal rather than consequence. The late Kevin Samuels used a metaphor that resonated with many people. He spoke about seasons, about preparation, about winter arriving for those who ignored the signs. That metaphor was not about cruelty, it was about realism. Every system has cycles. If you consume without replenishing, you eventually face scarcity. Right now, we are in the early stages of that reckoning. Men are not rushing back to rebuild what was torn down, not out of spite, but because the conditions that drove them away have not meaningfully changed. Apologies without accountability do not restore trust. Demands without reform do not inspire participation. The question society must answer is not why men walked away. That answer is already visible. The real question is whether the system is willing to change enough to make return worthwhile. That means balanced expectations, fair legal frameworks, mutual respect, and an honest acknowledgement of past mistakes on all sides. Until then, men walking away will continue quietly and steadily. And this is only the beginning. To understand where this goes next, you have to step back and look at how slow cultural shifts actually work. Most people imagine change as a loud event, something dramatic and obvious. In reality, the most powerful shifts happen quietly, over years, until one day everyone looks around and realizes the old assumptions no longer apply. That is exactly what is happening now. For decades, men were the shock absorbers of society. When systems failed, men filled the gaps. When resources were scarce, men worked longer hours. When expectations were unclear, hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Men were told to figure it out. That arrangement functioned because there was at least an implied social contract. You give effort, you receive respect, you give stability, you receive partnership, you accept responsibility, you gain authority. That contract was never perfect, but it existed. What changed is not that men suddenly became unwilling to contribute. What changed is that responsibility remained, while authority and respect eroded. Men were still expected to provide, but no longer allowed to lead. Still expected to sacrifice, but no longer trusted. Still expected to protect, but increasingly portrayed as the threat. That contradiction cannot persist indefinitely. Imagine being told you are essential and disposable at the same time. Imagine being told you are privileged while being blamed for outcomes you cannot control. Over time, the message becomes incoherent. When messaging loses coherence, people stop engaging emotionally and start making calculations. Those calculations are brutal in their simplicity. Is the effort worth the risk? Is the reward proportional to the cost? Is participation optional? For a growing number of men, the honest answer became no. This is where many commentators make a mistake. They assume men walking away is about resentment. It is not. Resentment burns hot and loud. What we are seeing is cool detachment, quiet refusal, a slow turning inward. That is far more consequential because it does not seek validation or confrontation. It simply redirects energy elsewhere. Look at where that energy is going. Men are investing more in skills, digital income, decentralized systems, solo hobbies, small trusted networks, and self sufficiency. They are building lives that are modular and low exposure. Fewer dependencies, fewer legal entanglements, fewer emotional liabilities. This is not nihilism, it is adaptation. At the same time, the broader culture kept assuming male participation was guaranteed. Policies were designed as if men would always comply, always show up, always absorb the pressure. That assumption is now proving false. When participation becomes voluntary rather than obligatory, the system suddenly looks very different. Dating is the most visible example, but it is not the only one. Marriage rates are declining because marriage now carries asymmetric risk. Fatherhood rates are declining because long term involvement is not matched by long term authority. Workplace engagement is shifting because loyalty is no longer reciprocated. None of this requires conspiracy or malice, it follows incentives. Now, contrast that with the messaging many women received. They were told they could have independence without isolation, authority without accountability, and choice without consequence. Again, this was not malicious, it was comforting, but comfort is not the same as truth. When reality finally asserts itself, the emotional shock is severe. We are starting to see that shock emerge: confusion, frustration, anger, a sense that something was promised and not delivered. The instinctive response is to demand compliance from men, to shame them back into participation, to label withdrawal as moral failure. But shame only works on people who care about the opinion of the shamer. Men who have already detached do not. This creates a feedback loop. The louder the demands become, the quieter the response gets. The more pressure applied, the less engagement occurs. That is not because men are being stubborn. It is because trust has been depleted. Trust is the invisible currency in any relationship. Once it is gone, no amount of rhetoric can replace it. You can pass laws, you can run campaigns, you can create slogans. None of that restores trust. Trust only returns when people see consistent, fair behavior over time. This is why sudden calls for men to step up ring hollow. From the male perspective, stepping up previously meant stepping into risk without protection. It meant sacrificing with no guarantee of appreciation or security. Asking men to repeat that behavior without structural change is asking them to ignore experience. There is also a generational layer to this. Younger men grew up watching older men struggle through divorce courts, custody battles, public accusations, and financial ruin. They learned the lesson early, not from ideology, but from observation. When a behavior consistently produces negative outcomes, rational actors avoid it. That is why appeals to nostalgia do not work. Telling men to return to a version of society that no longer exists does nothing. The conditions that supported traditional roles are gone. The legal framework, cultural norms, and economic realities have all shifted. Expecting traditional behavior without traditional protections is unrealistic. At the same time, many women are discovering that independence does not automatically create fulfillment. Autonomy is valuable, but humans are social creatures. Community matters. Partnership matters. Stability matters. When those things are absent, people feel it. The problem is that rebuilding trust requires humility, and humility has been in short supply. Instead of asking why men left, much of the discourse asks how to force them back. That is a critical error. Participation cannot be coerced without destroying its value. A relationship built on obligation rather than desire is not a relationship. It is a transaction enforced by threat. Men see this clearly. That is why many prefer solitude to compromised companionship. Solitude has costs, but they are predictable. Legal and emotional chaos does not. Another factor rarely discussed is how technology accelerated the shift. Men no longer need to rely on traditional social structures for entertainment, income, or connection. Remote work, online communities, digital finance, and decentralized platforms have reduced dependency on legacy systems. When exit options increase, tolerance for unfairness decreases. This is basic economics applied to human behavior. When alternatives exist, bad deals collapse. The modern relationship market is experiencing that exact phenomenon. Some people respond by accusing men of abandoning society. That accusation misunderstands causality. Men did not abandon society first. Society redefined men's role without renegotiating terms. Withdrawal was the result, not the cause. There is also a moral dimension that deserves attention. Men are often told they must endure discomfort for the greater good. That expectation was easier to accept when the greater good included them. When men are excluded from the benefits of the system, appeals to sacrifice lose credibility. This does not mean men are perfect or blameless. No group is, but responsibility must be proportionate and mutual. You cannot ask one side to carry the load while denying them voice and security. That imbalance eventually collapses. As this continues, we will see more visible consequences: fewer marriages, fewer families, lower birth rates, increased loneliness. These are not abstract trends. They shape economies, politics, and cultural stability. You cannot build a future on resentment and denial. The uncomfortable truth is that many institutions benefited from male compliance while undermining male well being. When that compliance ends, those institutions struggle. Rather than adapting, they often double down on moral pressure. That only accelerates disengagement. While men walking away is not a protest movement with leaders and slogans, it is a silent vote, a collective decision to stop participating in systems that no longer serve them. Silent votes are the hardest to counter because they do not argue. They simply withdraw consent. The path forward is not hostility, it is renegotiation, honest conversation, balanced reform. But that requires acknowledging uncomfortable realities. It requires admitting that some narratives went too far, that some incentives were distorted, that some protections were removed without replacement. Until that happens, the trend will continue. Men will keep building parallel lives, smaller, quieter, more controlled. Women will keep asking where everyone went. Institutions will keep issuing reports and campaigns. None of it will work unless the underlying imbalance is addressed. This is the stage we are in now, the early realization phase, the point where absence becomes noticeable, but solutions are still framed as demands rather than dialogue. What comes next depends on whether society chooses reflection or escalation, and that choice is approaching faster than most people realize. The reason reflection is so difficult right now is because reflection requires responsibility. And responsibility requires admitting that some choices produced outcomes no one wanted. Modern culture has become very good at reframing consequences as external failures. When something goes wrong, the instinct is to look outward for blame rather than inward for correction. That instinct works for a while, but it eventually runs into reality. Reality does not negotiate. It does not respond to slogans. It does not care how strongly something is believed. Reality simply responds to incentives, structures, and behavior over time. That is why this moment feels so jarring to so many people. The story they were told no longer matches what they are experiencing. For years, the absence of men was masked by momentum. Systems continued functioning because they were built on decades of accumulated effort. But momentum fades. Once it does, you start to see what was actually holding things together. What you are seeing now is not a sudden disappearance of men. It is the exposure of how much male participation was previously taken for granted. One of the most revealing patterns is how quickly the narrative shifts when conditions change. When times were stable, men were told they were optional. When times became uncertain, men were suddenly told they were essential again. That contradiction does not inspire trust. It signals opportunism. Trust cannot be switched on and off like a utility. It is built slowly and destroyed quickly. Once destroyed, it requires consistent effort to rebuild. That effort has to come from actions, not words. Men are watching closely, not for promises, but for patterns. Patterns are what matter here. When a man looks at the legal environment, he sees risk. When he looks at the cultural environment, he sees suspicion. When he looks at the economic environment, he sees instability. When he looks at social expectations, he sees obligation without appreciation. None of these factors alone would necessarily drive withdrawal. Together, they form a compelling case. This is why appeals to emotion fall flat. Telling men they are needed does not address why they left. Telling men they are wrong does not make participation safer. Telling men they owe society does not restore balance. Those messages assume compliance is still the default. It is not. Men are increasingly treating engagement as conditional on fairness, conditional on reciprocity, conditional on accountability. That shift changes everything. The most misunderstood aspect of men walking away is that it is not centered on relationships alone. Relationships are just where the effects are most visible. The deeper shift is psychological. Men are redefining what success means. It is no longer centered on approval or validation. It is centered on autonomy and peace. That redefinition has profound consequences. When approval loses value, shaming loses power. When validation loses importance, criticism loses leverage. When peace becomes the priority, chaos is rejected regardless of who offers it. This is why so many men appear disengaged from public discourse. They are not confused. They are not lost. They are simply uninterested in debates that do not affect their personal trajectory. Attention is a resource and they are allocating it carefully. At the same time, many women are experiencing a different kind of reckoning. Expectations formed under one set of conditions are colliding with a new reality. Independence is empowering, but it is also demanding. When support structures weaken, the burden becomes visible. This is not about assigning blame. It is about recognizing that systems require balance. When one side is encouraged to maximize benefit while minimizing responsibility, the system becomes unstable. Eventually, the other side opts out. The cultural response so far has been largely performative. Campaigns, panels, articles, and talking points that all circle the issue without touching its core. The core issue is incentives. Until incentives are realigned, outcomes will not change. Realignment would require uncomfortable reforms, legal neutrality, cultural humility, mutual standards, shared risk. None of these are popular talking points. They do not fit neatly into existing narratives, but they are necessary. Without reform, the future becomes predictable. More men disengage, fewer families form. Social trust erodes further. Institutions struggle to maintain legitimacy. The social fabric thins. Some will argue that society can simply adapt without men. That argument ignores practical reality. Infrastructure, innovation, maintenance, and defense do not run on ideology, they run on participation. When participation becomes selective, systems weaken. Others will argue that new generations will fix this naturally. That optimism ignores how deeply incentives shape behavior. Younger men are learning faster than older generations did. They have more data, more examples, and more alternatives. If anything, disengagement is accelerating. There is also an emotional toll that deserves acknowledgement. Walking away is not cost free. Many men would prefer meaningful partnership. They would prefer community. They would prefer stability. Withdrawal is not always chosen lightly, it is often chosen reluctantly. But when the alternative is ongoing risk with diminishing returns, reluctance gives way to resolve. This is where the discussion often becomes uncomfortable because it challenges deeply held assumptions. It challenges the idea that social progress is linear. It challenges the belief that good intentions guarantee good outcomes. It challenges the notion that one sided empowerment produces harmony. History shows otherwise. Balance matters, reciprocity matters, mutual respect matters. When those are absent, systems fracture. The conversation going forward must mature. It cannot rely on moral framing alone. It must incorporate practical reality. It must ask hard questions about what kind of society people actually want to live in and what they are willing to contribute to sustain it. Men walking away is not the end of the story, it is a signal. Signals can be ignored or they can be interpreted. Ignored signals become crises, interpreted signals become opportunities for correction. Right now, most institutions are choosing to ignore or misinterpret the signal. They frame withdrawal as deviance rather than feedback. That choice has consequences. Feedback ignored becomes louder, not quieter. The next phase will likely involve increased polarization, more attempts to shame or pressure men back into participation, more resistance, more fragmentation. That phase is already beginning. Whether it escalates or stabilizes depends on whether leadership emerges that understands the real issue. Not leaders who speak in abstractions, but leaders who address incentives, fairness, and trust directly. Until then, men will continue doing what they have been doing, building quietly, choosing selectively, protecting their time, resources, and mental space, not because they want conflict, but because they want peace. This is the reality of the moment, not dramatic, not sensational, simply consequential. And the longer it is avoided, the harder it becomes to reverse. One of the biggest mistakes people make when they look at the situation is assuming that men are waiting to be convinced. They are not. Convincing implies uncertainty. What you are seeing instead is decision. Once a decision hardens, persuasion has very little effect. That is why so many efforts to re engage men feel ineffective. They are aimed at a mindset that no longer exists. Men did not arrive here suddenly. This was not a viral moment or a trend sparked by social media. This was a long accumulation of lived experience. Small moments repeated thousands of times. A comment here, a policy there, a public accusation that went unchallenged, a private sacrifice that went unnoticed. Over time, these moments formed a pattern. Patterns shape belief far more than speeches ever could. When men talk privately, they rarely speak in ideological terms. They talk about risk. They talk about exposure. They talk about how one decision could undo decades of effort. They talk about watching friends lose access to their children. They talk about reputations destroyed without recourse. They talk about being told to be vulnerable, only to see that vulnerability later used against them. These are not abstract fears. They are observed outcomes. This is why the conversation feels stalled. One side is speaking in moral language, while the other is responding in practical terms. Moral language says what should be. Practical language responds to what is. When those two are misaligned, no progress occurs. Another layer that rarely gets discussed is how emotional labor has been redefined. Men are expected to provide emotional support, patience, understanding, and stability, often without reciprocity. At the same time, they are discouraged from expressing their own frustration or boundaries. When expression is punished and endurance is demanded, withdrawal becomes the only remaining option. This creates a strange paradox. Men are told they must be more emotionally available, but when they are, the response is often dismissal or suspicion. Over time, many learn to conserve emotional energy. They become selective. They stop volunteering care where it is not respected. Meanwhile, the broader culture continues to frame male disengagement as immaturity or avoidance. That framing misses the point entirely. Avoidance implies fear. What is happening is calculation. Men are not avoiding responsibility, they are choosing which responsibilities are worth assuming. This choice extends beyond relationships into civic life, work, and community involvement. And loyalty to institutions is weakening. Long term commitments are viewed skeptically. Flexibility and exit options are prioritized. This is rational behavior in an environment perceived as unstable. The irony is that many of the same voices calling for male re engagement also support systems that discourage it. They want effort without leverage, contribution without voice, presence without power. That is not partnership, that is compliance. Compliance can be enforced for a time, but it cannot sustain genuine investment. People comply until they can leave. Once they can leave, they do. Technology has accelerated this exit. Men no longer need traditional approval structures to live full lives. Entertainment, education, income, and social connection can all be accessed independently. The cost of disengagement has decreased while the cost of participation has increased. That equation is decisive. Some critics argue that this leads to social fragmentation. They are correct. But fragmentation is not caused by withdrawal alone. It is caused by systems that fail to adapt when participation becomes optional. Blaming those who leave does not address why they left. There is also a tendency to underestimate how long these shifts last. Cultural memory is long. Once a generation internalizes a lesson, it carries forward. Younger men are watching older men closely. They are not eager to repeat mistakes. That means, even if reforms begin tomorrow, trust will take time to rebuild. Rebuilding trust requires more than reassurance. It requires visible, enforceable fairness. It requires demonstrating that good faith will not be punished. It requires acknowledging past excesses without defensiveness. None of this is easy, which is why it has largely been avoided. Instead, much of the conversation defaults to urgency without substance, calls to act without clarity, appeals to step up without safeguards. This only reinforces skepticism. Men have heard it before. There is a quiet confidence emerging among men who have stepped away. Not arrogance, not hostility. Confidence rooted in self reliance. When someone knows they can survive independently, they are less susceptible to pressure. They negotiate from choice, not need. That shift changes interpersonal dynamics dramatically. Relationships formed under these conditions are fewer, but more intentional. Men who re engage do so cautiously. They set boundaries early. They walk away quickly from imbalance. They are not trying to fix systems, they are protecting themselves. This is why the old playbook no longer works, guilt no longer motivates, obligation no longer binds, fear no longer compels, only fairness attracts. The uncomfortable truth is that many men are happier now than they were before. Not because isolation is ideal, but because predictability reduces stress. When the rules are clear and self defined, life feels manageable. Chaos, even when labeled meaningful, is still chaos. That does not mean this outcome is optimal for society as a whole. A society where large numbers of men disengage is less resilient. It has fewer builders, fewer mentors, fewer stabilizing forces. But acknowledging that requires confronting the policies and narratives that drove disengagement in the first place. The window for course correction still exists, but it is narrowing. Every year of denial hardens positions. Every dismissed concern deepens mistrust. Every attempt to force compliance confirms the reasons men left. What would real correction look like? It would look like neutrality in law. It would look like shared standards of behavior. It would look like accountability applied consistently. It would look like respect that does not disappear when it is inconvenient. Until then, the trend will continue quietly, persistently, without drama. Men will keep choosing peace over participation, autonomy over approval, stability over chaos, and not because they hate society, but because they learned how it actually works. As this pattern continues, something subtle but important happens beneath the surface. Expectations begin to recalibrate, not loudly, not publicly, quietly. Men stop expecting institutions to protect them. They stop expecting cultural narratives to be fair. They stop expecting relationships to be safe by default. Instead, they expect volatility and they plan accordingly. Planning for volatility changes how people live. You invest differently, you commit differently, you trust differently. You do not assume permanence. You do not assume goodwill. You do not assume that effort will be recognized. You assume that outcomes are uncertain and that safeguards matter more than promises. This is why so many men are focused on independence right now: financial independence, geographic flexibility, digital skill sets, decentralized systems, portable lifestyles. These are not trends driven by rebellion. They are responses to instability. When the ground feels unreliable, people build structures that can move. What is often misunderstood is that this shift is not rooted in bitterness. Bitterness fades. What replaces it is clarity. Once clarity sets in, People stop arguing about fairness and start designing around unfairness. They stop trying to change the environment and instead optimize their position within it. That is a fundamental change in mindset. For a long time, men believed that participation itself would improve the system, that if they showed up, worked harder, communicated better, and compromised more, things would stabilize. Many tried, many failed, not because they were incapable, but because the system was not designed to reward that effort consistently. At some point, the realization sets in that effort alone is not enough. Structure matters. Incentives matter. Enforcement matters. Without those, goodwill becomes a liability rather than an asset. This is where a lot of frustration comes from on the outside looking in. People see men disengaging and assume apathy. They see fewer marriages and assume immaturity. They see solitude and assume loneliness. What they often miss is the sense of control that comes with choosing your exposure. Control is deeply calming. When you know what you are responsible for and what you are not, stress decreases. When you can predict outcomes, even modest ones, anxiety drops. When you are no longer constantly navigating shifting expectations, mental energy is freed. That freedom is intoxicating once experienced. It is very difficult to convince someone to give it up for uncertainty. This creates a divide between rhetoric and reality. Public conversations talk about connection, community, and shared values. Private behavior moves toward caution, selectivity, and boundaries. The two rarely meet because one is aspirational and the other is adaptive. The adaptive behavior is winning. Another uncomfortable reality is that many men have realized they are more useful to society from a distance than from inside unstable systems. They build businesses, they develop tools, they create content, they mentor selectively. They contribute indirectly rather than embedding themselves in environments that expose them to disproportionate risk. This kind of contribution is harder to regulate, harder to control, and harder to shame. That makes it threatening to centralized narratives that rely on predictable participation. When contribution becomes optional and decentralized, authority weakens. That is why there is so much emphasis on trying to reframe withdrawal as moral failure. If withdrawal is immoral, then pressure becomes justified. But morality loses force when it is applied selectively. Men notice that too. Selective morality breeds cynicism. Cynicism breeds disengagement. Disengagement weakens systems. This is the loop society is now stuck in. The real danger here is not disagreement. Societies can survive disagreement. The danger is indifference. Indifference is when people stop caring enough to argue. When that happens, systems decay quietly until something breaks. Men walking away is not loud enough to trigger emergency response, but it is large enough to matter. That makes it easy to underestimate and hard to reverse. By the time consequences are undeniable, the people who could have helped have already moved on. You can already see early signs: declining participation in civic institutions, reduced volunteerism, lower engagement in long term planning. These trends are often blamed on technology or distraction, but that is incomplete. The deeper cause is loss of perceived fairness. People invest where they feel respected, they withdraw where they feel exploited. This principle is universal. It applies to work, relationships, and societies alike. One of the hardest truths to accept is that good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. Many policies and cultural shifts were implemented with the stated goal of fairness and protection. Some succeeded, others overshot. When overshoot occurs, correction is required. Refusing to correct does not preserve progress, it undermines it. Men are not asking for dominance, they are asking for balance. They are asking for predictable rules, they are asking for equal accountability. These are not extreme demands, they are foundational requirements for trust. Without trust, every interaction becomes transactional. Without trust, people hedge constantly. Without trust, cooperation becomes fragile. That fragility is what you are seeing now. The longer this continues, the more entrenched it becomes. Men who have built stable, independent lives are unlikely to abandon them without compelling reason. Comfort with solitude grows over time. Skills compound. Networks strengthen. The cost of reentry rises. This means that even if cultural narratives shift tomorrow, behavioral change will lag. Trust is not restored by announcement, it is restored by experience. Repeated, consistent experience over time. That timeline does not align well with political cycles, media attention spans, or institutional incentives, which is why the problem persists. There is also a personal dimension that deserves empathy. Many men did not want this outcome. They wanted families. They wanted partnership. They wanted shared purpose. Walking away was not the dream. It was the compromise. Compromises, once accepted, become preferences. What begins as loss becomes routine. Routine becomes normal. Normal becomes defended. This is why arguments framed around loss do not resonate. Telling men what they are missing assumes they agree with the valuation. Many no longer do. The future will likely involve parallel paths. Some men will re engage under carefully defined conditions, others will remain detached. Society will adapt unevenly. Tension will persist. The question is whether adaptation happens through reform or through continued erosion. Reform requires listening without prejudgment. It requires acknowledging that disengagement is feedback, not rebellion. It requires recognizing that stability cannot be demanded, only earned. Until that happens, men walking away will remain a rational response to an irrational environment. Quiet, steady, unannounced, and increasingly permanent. At some point, every system reaches a moment where it must decide whether it wants truth or comfort. Comfort tells people what they want to hear. Truth explains what is actually happening. Right now, most institutions are still choosing comfort, even as reality keeps intruding. Comfort says that this is a temporary phase, that men will return once emotions cool down, that everything will stabilize on its own. Truth says that behavioral shifts of the scale do not reverse without structural change. Comfort reassures. Truth demands adjustment. The reason truth feels so threatening is because it implies responsibility. If men walking away is a rational response, then something in the environment is broken. And if something is broken, someone has to fix it. That is far less appealing than blaming those who leave. Blame is easy, correction is hard. There's also a psychological resistance to admitting that certain narratives went too far. Many people built identities around those narratives. Careers, reputations, and moral authority are tied to them. Acknowledging unintended consequences feels like personal failure, so denial becomes the default defense. But denial has a cost. Every year of denial pushes disengaged men further away. Every year of denial teaches younger men that participation is optional at best and dangerous at worst. Those lessons do not fade easily. This is also why appeals framed around crisis often miss their mark. When people say society needs men now more than ever, men hear that they are needed as tools, not as partners. Being needed is not the same as being valued. Tools are used until they break. Partners are protected. That distinction matters. Men are not refusing responsibility. They are refusing asymmetry. They are not rejecting contribution. They are rejecting vulnerability without safeguards. Once you understand that, their behavior becomes predictable. Predictability is the opposite of chaos. Men walking away are not creating instability, they are responding to it. Another aspect rarely discussed is how the definition of masculinity has been distorted. On one hand, men are told traditional masculinity is harmful. On the other hand, they are still expected to perform traditionally masculine functions during emergencies. This double bind creates confusion and resentment. You cannot dismantle an identity and then demand its benefits remain available. If masculinity is framed as suspect, men will disengage from roles associated with it. That is not rebellion, that is coherence. Coherence matters deeply to men. When expectations align with values, effort flows naturally. When expectations contradict values, effort dries up. This is why many men have shifted toward personal codes rather than social ones. They define their own standards. They decide what they will tolerate. They choose where to invest energy. This internal framework replaces external approval. Once that internal framework is established, external pressure loses its force. You cannot shame someone who no longer measures success by your standards. This creates a disconnect between public discourse and private reality. Public discourse still assumes moral leverage. Private reality has moved on. That gap is widening. As the gap widens, frustration increases on both sides. Women feel abandoned. Institutions feel undermined. Men feel misunderstood. Each group interprets the situation through its own lens, often without listening to the others. Listening is difficult because it requires humility. Humility requires admitting you might be wrong. That is rare in polarized environments. But without humility, no correction is possible. The longer this persists, the more entrenched the outcome becomes. New social norms form around disengagement. Opting out becomes normalized. Alternative life paths gain legitimacy. The idea that fulfillment must come through traditional structures weakens. This does not mean those structures disappear entirely. It means they become optional rather than expected. Optional systems must compete for participation. They must offer value. They must be fair. Many current systems are not prepared for that competition. There's also a demographic reality that cannot be ignored. Fewer stable partnerships mean fewer children. Fewer children mean long-term economic and social challenges. These are not ideological issues, they are practical ones. You cannot sustain complex societies without continuity. Continuity requires families, mentorship, and long-term investment. When those decline, systems strain. Men understand this. That is why many feel conflicted. They see the larger picture. They know disengagement has consequences. But they also know that sacrificing themselves for systems that do not protect them is not noble. It is naive. Nobility without reciprocity becomes exploitation. This is the quiet moral reckoning happening right now. Not a loud rebellion, not a dramatic collapse, a slow recalibration of responsibility based on lived experience. Some will accuse men of selfishness. That accusation assumes self-sacrifice is owed. Owed to whom exactly and on what terms? Those questions rarely get answered clearly. Others will accuse men of abandoning women. That accusation ignores the fact that many men were told to leave. They complied. Now they are being asked why they are gone. You cannot reverse disengagement without acknowledging how it started. This is where leadership matters, not leadership that scolds, leadership that listens, leadership that reforms, leadership that understands incentives. So far, that leadership has been scarce. Instead, we see reactive measures. More messaging, more campaigns, more moral appeals, less structural change. That imbalance guarantees continued withdrawal. Men are patient. But patience has limits. Many have already crossed the point of no return. The men who remain open to re-engagement are watching closely. They are not asking for perfection. They are looking for direction, signs that balance is possible, evidence that fairness is more than a talking point. If those signs appear, some will return. If not, the trend continues, quietly, relentlessly, and without apology. Men walking away was not created by a single idea, a single voice, or a single generation. It emerged because incentives changed, protections weakened, and expectations became one-sided. Men adapted the only way they could without destroying themselves. Quietly, individually, rationally. What many still struggle to accept is that this withdrawal is not driven by hostility. It is driven by boundaries. Boundaries formed after repeated lessons. Boundaries formed after observing patterns that did not improve despite years of effort and compromise. Once boundaries exist, they do not dissolve easily. This does not mean reconciliation is impossible. It means reconciliation requires honesty. It requires acknowledging that balance was lost. It requires rebuilding trust through actions rather than words. It requires systems that protect everyone equally, not selectively. Without that, appeals for unity ring hollow. The future is not predetermined, but the trajectory is clear. If nothing changes, disengagement becomes the norm. If reform happens, participation becomes possible again. That choice does not belong to men alone, it belongs to society as a whole. Men have already made their adjustment. They have learned to live with fewer expectations and more control. They have learned that peace often costs less than participation. Reversing that lesson requires more than nostalgia or pressure, it requires proof. What happens next will shape relationships, families, economies, and culture for decades. This is not a small issue, it is a foundational one. And pretending it is temporary will not make it so. As we move into the final stretch of this conversation, it is important to slow down and really absorb what this moment represents. Because this is not just a disagreement between groups or a phase driven by online discourse. This is a structural shift in how men relate to society, to institutions, and to each other. These shifts do not announce themselves loudly. They show up in patterns. They show up in absence. They show up when expectations no longer match behavior, and no amount of messaging seems to close the gap. For a long time, society assumed male participation was automatic. Men would show up. Men would work longer. Men would absorb pressure. Men would compromise. Men would adapt. That assumption became so deeply embedded that it was no longer recognized as an assumption at all. It was treated as a law of nature, and like all false laws, it eventually failed. Men did not stop caring overnight. They did not wake up one day and collectively decide to disengage. What happened instead was far more subtle and far more powerful. Men paid attention. They watched outcomes. They observed how effort was rewarded, how mistakes were punished, how responsibility was distributed, and how quickly goodwill evaporated when things went wrong. Over time, patterns became clear. Once patterns become clear, behavior changes, and this is the part of the story that often gets skipped. Men tried, they tried to communicate, they tried to adjust, they tried to meet shifting expectations, they tried to be more open, more accommodating, more understanding. Many did this sincerely. Many did this at personal cost, and many discovered that the rules kept changing anyway. When effort does not lead to stability, people stop offering effort freely. That is not bitterness. That is learning. The modern conversation often treats disengagement as a moral failure, but morality without symmetry collapses into resentment. Men are not rejecting responsibility, they are rejecting responsibility without protection, obligation without authority, and sacrifice without appreciation. These are not extreme positions, they are baseline requirements for cooperation. There is a tendency to frame this moment as a crisis of masculinity. That framing misses the point entirely. This is not about men forgetting how to be men. It is about men remembering that their time, energy, and resources have value. Once someone internalizes that truth, they stop giving those things away indiscriminately. This is why so many men appear calm about disengagement. From the outside, it may look like apathy. From the inside, it feels like relief. Relief from constant vigilance, relief from unpredictable risk, relief from having to justify boundaries that should have been respected in the first place. That relief is powerful. It changes priorities, it changes tolerance levels, it changes how men evaluate relationships, institutions, and commitments. Once peace becomes the baseline, chaos becomes unacceptable, regardless of who offers it or how it is framed. What makes this moment so difficult is that many people still believe disengagement can be reversed with the right words. That if men are reminded of duty, or guilted into responsibility, or warned about consequences, they will fall back into line. That belief assumes men are acting emotionally. They are not. They are acting strategically. Strategies are not undone by speeches. They are undone by better incentives. If participation is to return, it must be made rational again. That means predictable rules, balanced accountability, clear boundaries, fair enforcement. Without those, appeals to unity are just noise. There is also a deeper issue that deserves attention. Men are increasingly aware that once trust is broken, it cannot be restored by intention alone. Trust is not rebuilt by asking, it is rebuilt by demonstration. And demonstration takes time. Time is something many men are no longer willing to invest without evidence. They have seen too many cycles of promises followed by regression. Too many moments where stability was offered verbally but undermined structurally. At some point, patience turns into resolve. This is why many men have chosen to build parallel lives rather than wait for reform. They are not waiting for permission. They are not asking for validation. They are constructing lives that are smaller, more controlled, and more resilient. These lives may not look impressive from the outside, but they are sustainable. Sustainability matters more than optics. Society often celebrates resilience in theory, but resents it in practice. When people adapt successfully, it exposes systemic failure. It forces uncomfortable questions. It highlights that participation was not voluntary, but expected. When expectation disappears, systems must compete. Many are not equipped to do so. The uncomfortable truth is that disengaged men are no longer motivated by approval. That changes everything. When approval loses value, social pressure loses effectiveness. When pressure fails, only reform remains. Reform, however, requires admitting that something went wrong. It requires acknowledging that certain policies, narratives, and cultural shifts had unintended consequences. It requires letting go of moral certainty in favor of practical correction. That is difficult in an environment built on ideological confidence. But reality does not care about confidence. It responds to outcomes. Like the outcome right now is clear. Men are opting out where they can. They are minimizing exposure. They are choosing peace over participation when participation feels unsafe or unrewarded. This is not a protest. It is an adaptation. Adaptations persist until the environment changes. The next generation is watching closely. Young men are learning earlier what older men learned later. They have more information, more examples, more exit options. That means disengagement is not only continuing, it is becoming normalized. Normalization is the point of no return for many systems. Once something becomes normal, reversing it requires extraordinary effort. The longer normalization continues, the less emotional weight appeals to tradition carry. Tradition only works when it offers protection as well as obligation. Remove one, and the other collapses. This is why so many men reject nostalgic arguments. They are not nostalgic for a system that demanded loyalty without reciprocity. They are not interested in returning to roles stripped of authority and security. Nostalgia does not solve structural problems. At the same time, many men still care deeply about the future. They are not indifferent to societal decline. They understand the consequences of fragmentation. They know what is lost when families dissolve and trust erodes. But understanding consequences does not obligate self sacrifice. Self sacrifice without safeguards is no longer viewed as virtuous, it is viewed as foolish. This is the moral shift that few want to discuss. The idea that suffering for the system is inherently noble has lost credibility. People want evidence that their sacrifice will not be punished or exploited. That demand is reasonable. The challenge is that many institutions are not prepared to offer that evidence. They were built on assumptions of compliance. They did not plan for opt out behavior. Now that opt out behavior is widespread, they are struggling to respond. Some will attempt coercion, others will attempt shaming, others will attempt distraction. None of these address the core issue. They may delay consequences, but they cannot reverse them. The only path forward is reform grounded in reality. That means fairness in law, consistency in enforcement, mutual accountability, respect that does not vanish when it is inconvenient. These are not radical demands. They are prerequisites for trust. Until those prerequisites are met, men will continue to choose distance, not out of spite, not out of anger, out of clarity. Clarity is the final stage of disengagement. Once clarity is reached, people stop arguing, they stop explaining, they stop seeking understanding, they simply act. That is where we are now. This does not mean the story is over. It means the next chapter will be written by actions rather than words, by structures rather than slogans, by incentives rather than intentions. Whether society adapts or fractures further remains to be seen. But pretending this is temporary or emotional will only accelerate decline. Men walking away is not about rejecting women. It is about rejecting imbalance. It is not about avoiding responsibility. It is about refusing asymmetry. It is not about hostility. It is about boundaries. Boundaries are not negotiable once established. They can only be respected or ignored. Ignored boundaries harden. Respected boundaries soften. The choice is still available, but it is not unlimited. And before we end, I want to ask you directly, what do you think about what was discussed in this video? Do you agree with this assessment or do you see it differently? Have you noticed these patterns in your own life, your friendships, or your community? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. Honest discussion matters more now than ever. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.